the post-independence African country or countries are bedeviled by many things. That could be a reason. It has also been said that part of the reason why we have not realized our potential is because we make the wrong choices. And that could very well be true. And my brother who spoke about choices so very well told us that it all rests on the choices that you make. And you who are Christians will remember that at critical moments, even in the Christian tradition, it has always been a question of choices. If you read the book of 1 Kings at chapter 18, when there is conflict in that little place called Israel, Elijah summons them and says, choose you now. If Baal is God, bring the 450 disciples of Baal and the 400 of Asherah who dined with Jezebel. And if God is God, let him be worshipped. If Baal is Baal, let him be worshipped. Perhaps that is the reason why we are where we are. We never make the right choices. We choose Baal when we should be choosing God. There are those who have said possibly, and you see this choice if you read the book of Joshua chapter 24, when he calls the Israelites and tells them, choose you now. Do you want to worship the gods whom your ancestors worshipped before they crossed the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell? As for me and my house, we shall serve the Lord. Perhaps we are not serving the gods, and that the gods are angry. And in the anger, they continue to visit pain upon us. So there is a sense in which all and many things have been talked about. But Africa sometimes judges ourselves very harshly and with a jaundiced sense of history. The post-colonial African state, the oldest post-colonial African state is Ghana, 66 years only. Nigeria, 63 years only. And we often forget these very important and immortal words of John Henry Clark when he said that all African countries, upon regaining independence, started to conduct their affairs on the basis of systems of governments that were borrowed from Europe, and that none of them will ever succeed on the basis of borrowed systems. And as if he were a Jewish prophet, he is being proven right on a daily basis. Because whenever we in the African countries think that we have identified the problem and that we have identified the antidote, when we apply the antidote, new wounds appear. That has been the state of Africa, and that continues to be our state. And therefore, when we judge Africa, we must ask ourselves, from whose lens are we judging Africa? When in 1965, the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah wrote the book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, and the Most Dangerous, he was right, and he was overthrown for it, because the colonizer left but never left. And if you have any doubt, see what is happening in Niger, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, in Mali. They are alive and well. And Africa remains the only continent in the world that is still referred to as Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone, and now we are beginning to even call it Russophone and Sinophone and Indophone. There is a sense in which we must never forget this, so that when we are judging Africa, we ought to judge her on the basis and upon the realization that the headwinds that stand on our path are numerous, and that there is no shortage of fifth columnists within our ranks. The SMO spoke, and if the SMO were to speak a little longer, he would have reminded you of what Chinua Achebe said in Things Fall Apart, that they came and put the things that held us together, and we can no longer reason as one. And he said, we may have sent the white man away, but what about our brothers whose minds they have infected and infested? And there is no shortage of them. So Africa can and will arise. And if you look at the continent of Africa, she has always been conscious of the need to do right things. And if you look at the continent since 1963, and I can remember this so very vividly, I can remember Kwame Nkrumah in 1957 on the 6th of March saying, the freedom of Ghana means nothing if the rest of Africa is not free. He says the same thing in 1958. He repeats the same thing in 1960 in Casablanca, Morocco. He repeats it again on 25th of May, 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where he tells the 32 heads of states gathered there, we must live here with one army. We must live here with one currency. We must live here with one foreign policy coordinated. And I even suggest that we can have a capital, and I suggest Bangui in Central African Republic because it is the most central. But we listen to him not. After that, of course, we have had our gains. Under the aegis of the OAU, Africa was able to eliminate apartheid, South Africa. Under the aegis of the OAU, Africa was able to chase away the Portuguese in Cabo Verde, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau. Under the aegis of the OAU, Africa was able to chase away the apartheid regime in what is now Namibia and the Ian Smith regime in what is now Zimbabwe. Let us not judge ourselves too harshly. We have made our mistakes, but sometimes it is proper, as my sister said, that we see half full glass rather than half empty. We must not debilitate ourselves by constantly bashing ourselves and looking at Africa from jaundiced eyes from Europe and America. And I'm suggesting to you, we have and will continue to make our mistakes. Look at Africa and the decision that she has made for herself over the years. As early as 1980, Africans sitting here in Lagos, Nigeria, came up with the Lagos Plan of Action. And the Lagos Plan of Action told Africa, in order for Africa to realize our potential, we must trade amongst ourselves. But the neo-colonizer was not resting. A little earlier, 5 years earlier, the neo-colonizers had sat down in Lomé, in Togo, not too far from here, and came up with an agreement of African and European and Pacific countries. And when that did not work, they sat again in Cotonou, here in Benin, and came up with the Cotonou Agreement. They are never resting. We must never forget that. The neo-colonialists are alive and well, and is always trying to frustrate what we do because Africa is their hunting ground. And we did not stop there. When we are doing things, you tell me what Africa has not tried to do. In terms of the airspace, we agreed in Yamoussoukro, in La Côte d'Ivoire, that we will open our airspaces in 1988. We sat in Abuja, here in Nigeria, in 2001 and said we were going to spend not less than 15% of our budget in the health sector. We sat in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea in 2014 and said we were going to focus on agriculture. We sat down in Maputo in 2013 and said we were going to ensure that our women were mainstreamed in the activities of Africa. We sat down in Abuja in 2013, in 2014 and said we were going to have free movement of people, and once again sat down in Kigali, Rwanda 2018 and said we were going to eliminate visas. We sat down in Abuja and said that we were going to silence the guns in 2013. We did not. And we sat down in 2020 and said we were going to silence them. And now the guns are alive and well. And who are supplying us with the weapons? It is not us. It is others. Should we blame them? Yes, we should. Should we blame ourselves? Yes, we should. So Africa has always been a battleground. And the rhetoric that we see and the manner in which we ourselves are educated. My sister talked about education. But really, what are we teaching ourselves? His fella Nicola Pokuti said, "Teacher, don't teach me nonsense." And I'm suggesting to us that most of us, including most of us who are here, we are so very thoroughly miseducated that what we must do is to unlearn the burden that we have in our mind. Those of us who are lawyers, when do we feel happiest? When we cite an English authority to determine a land case in Abeokuta. When we talk about the reasonable man, we don't talk about the reasonable man in a keke, in a papa. We talk about the reasonable man being the man in the Clapham omnibus in London, England. That is how miseducated we are. And until we are re-educated, we who are present here are part of the danger to Africa. Because even in our unguarded moments, I went several years ago to the university at Harvard and talking to students, and one of them said that Harvard was the best school in law, in teaching of law. I said, whose law? Nigerian law? Ugandan law? Zimbabwean law? They can only be best in teaching their law, not ours. And I've seen we who are in this space of education, somebody spends 6 years at Unilag, and when they go to Harvard or Stanford for 3 weeks for a short course where they spend most of the time taking tea, he comes back and says, an alumni of Harvard. So the time is now. The time is now to begin re-educating ourselves. The time is now to exercise the ghost of low self-esteem.